Clay Patton on the Rural Radio Network. Let's talk China, and let's talk with one of the foremost experts as it relates to commodities. That is Arlan Suderman, Chief Economist with StoneX. Arlan, we appreciate the time today, and really a lot of this sparks up from the last conversation I was able to have with you in our program, the Fontenelle Final Bell, as we talked about China and its implications, its zero-tolerance COVID policies, and more. Since that conversation there, we talked about the Foxconn plant as well, maybe some hints that they were thinking about shifting their policy. Has there been any developments with China's thoughts towards their zero-tolerance COVID policies?
No, there really has. China is still a mystery to a lot of people in the world, and I think they like to keep it a mystery to a great extent. But President Xi Jinping built his reputation on managing COVID, in his view, to keep the people of China safe. And so he developed the dynamic zero policy for COVID. Now, since then, as you know, we've seen these multiple variants of COVID come along that have mutated into, and it is very typical of virus, the typical way is they mutate into something that spreads faster and faster, but is less and less lethal. And we've seen that in China as well. But as that happens, that makes dynamic zero even increasingly difficult to enforce because it spreads so fast, it spreads before they can get a lockdown in a particular area and isolate the cases they have. And so as I talk to my employee that I have in Shanghai and ask her what life is like, she goes, well, it's normal. We just get tested every day. And I said, isn't it amazing how we redefine normal? And she laughs and says, yes, testing every day. But as people are tested, they're also then in danger, if they've been out and about, of getting notified on their phone by the government, you have to report to a quarantine center. And so she tells me people fear getting notified that they have to report to a quarantine center more than they fear COVID itself. There's very little talk of any actual deaths from COVID. And so all that fear is causing people to stay home and not go out and shop. It's hurting their economy. And you mentioned the Foxconn plant, which is where many of the iPhone 14s are manufactured. And now it's Christmas time coming up. And so Apple's trying to get them as many as they can delivered to their customers around the world. And that plant had an outbreak. And outbreaks under a zero dynamic policy means that if you have been exposed, you have to be quarantined, and that hurts production. We had people fleeing by the thousands from the plant trying to get away, police trying to round them up. That's just a microcosm of what's happening in China. The hope was that they would open up their economy. Health officials last weekend reinstated their commitment to the dynamic zero policy because that's what Xi Jinping wants, and he's removed anyone from the leadership circle who would question him, meaning he's only hearing the opinions that people think he wants to hear, so it very well may not change for quite some time.
It's interesting, his thought process towards that. Now, Xi Jinping is in what is somewhat an unprecedented third term. As some analysts have pointed, he kind of went on more of a Mao-type trip. He's becoming more and more Mao instinctive in one central seat of power. So in China, there's this very strict top-down power structure, but we know these strict lockdowns are causing some major economic damage. Is there a point at which economic prosperity versus damage is going to help offset what he has seen as a protection of the people with their strict policies?
Well, that's what logic would suggest, the direction we're going. The question is Xi Jinping getting the information that he needs to make good decisions? Just as we've seen with President Putin, when you purge the leadership around you of anyone who has a differing opinion, then all you hear is what people think you want to hear, and that often leads to bad policy decisions. We don't know that that's the case yet with Xi Jinping in China. We know that he has purged the leadership circle. We don't know if it's yet limited the type of information that he's getting, but it would certainly seem like he is hanging on to this policy longer than what logic would suggest would be appropriate, particularly with how COVID has changed and become less lethal in nature and more difficult to control with that policy. So meanwhile, COVID numbers in China are rapidly escalating in some of their manufacturing and export centers, and now even starting to get a little bit of a foothold in Beijing itself.
And let's talk about China's aggressive policy and more of a global feature. China has out and out said they want to be the leading superpower in the world, both economically and the military, as well, even in land, trying to take Taiwan and bringing it back into the fold. So now that they're in the third year of fighting the pandemic, their economy is shrinking. They're not able to see that expansive growth. The Chinese yuan is on some of its lowest levels we've seen in over a decade. Is that hurting their global initiative? I know the road and bridge program with the BRIC nations, that was something that they were investing a lot into. Are those countries stepping away? Is China changing up anything with that road and bridge initiative?
Well, that initiative was really designed, I believe, in order to try to make other countries dependent upon them. China's basic economy is dependent upon being able to expand its borders, so to speak, its borders of influence and economic influence, because its population is aging. And with the one-child policy it had for many, many years, we're now at the cusp of an aging population with, even though they've changed that policy now, it's hard to change the culture to want more than one child. And so they don't have enough young people really to support their economy. So one way they can do it is expand out to other parts of the world to bring revenue in, and in the process also make those nations dependent upon them so that they kind of vote with them, so to speak, in the United Nations or wherever decisions are being made in the G7, G20 or whatever, and are supportive of them, particularly in this world of more conflict and issues. China wants people on their side, and if they're dependent upon trade with you, they're likely to do that. They've gone much quieter with that initiative because it was starting to be exposed kind of what they were doing during the Trump administration, but they're still selectively pursuing those efforts and moving forward where they feel like it is very strategic, maybe being a little bit more strategic than what they were before. So that is still moving forward. China thinks long range. We think in 2 and 4 year cycles, because that's the election cycle. They think over the next 50 to 100 years what's going to do them best. They're playing the long game.
And when you're thinking about the long game, I go to U.S. ag production. China, one of their staples is soybeans. We think about the soybean trade with China. With their weaker economic policy right now and not being able to invest as heavily in these other nations that they want to try and bring more into the fold. And top of mind is Brazil. Brazilian soybeans end up in China on a drastic scale. With this current weak economic infrastructure, does this help the U.S. to stay in the market a little bit longer, or does this truly help continue to cement that China has to do some work with the U.S. and play ball with us so they can get their commodities like soybeans?
Well, from an agricultural standpoint, they are currently dependent on us because there are things they need for feeding their people. And you mentioned a big one, the soybeans, necessary to make the soy meal in order to feed the hogs that their people need, the meat protein and stuff. And that's continuing. Now, they imported in the last marketing year about 32 million metric tons of soybeans from the United States. If the rains continue to fall in Brazil this year, Brazil's production is expected to go up by 27 million metric tons. That would virtually bring their production to a high enough level to virtually be able to displace most of the soybeans that China gets from the United States. China has also entered into an agreement with Brazil to be able to import soy meal from Brazil as well, in addition to corn too. So they could meet their needs. Maybe reshuffling the customers, we may get some of Brazil's other customers if that happens, but that would enable China to get away without doing business directly with the United States. Where they still have troubles is they're very dependent on all the products that they export to the United States. That's where it would be very difficult for them to do without doing business with the United States. That's the biggest challenge right there that has them reluctant to take military action against Taiwan, although they feel in their mind they're being pushed in a corner to do it sooner and later, and ultimately that's the top prize, that's the top goal, is get control of Taiwan. That's really the mother lode prize for them.
And Arlan, we're running a little short on time. I want to make sure we get to this question, though, as well. For the farmers, they're listening to our conversation right now. Where does China play into their marketing plan? Should it really impact anything, or focus on what they have when it comes to their own supply-demand needs and concerns?
You can't ignore China when it's the world's largest importer of commodities, of ag and energy, etc. But we have to recognize with any marketing plan that while we pay attention to demand coming out of China, that could all end overnight whenever China decides to make a move on Taiwan. And if we wake up in the morning and hear the headline that China's made a move on Taiwan, we can anticipate the commodity markets are going to expect that to hurt our sales, and we could be limit down across the board in the grain and oil seeds if that were to happen. So that you always have to know that risk factor is there if you have unpriced grain and oil seeds.
That's Arlan Suderman, chief economist with StoneX, joining us here talking a China special about its implications, what we could see going forward. Thanks for listening to the Rural Radio Network.